We're going to be using the GitHub API to grab users. Now, the GitHub API is really cool to use for demo applications because it gives out some free information. That means we don't have to authenticate to get user information. It makes it really easy to use for demo apps. Here, I'm on developer.github.com, and this is where we can see the API documentation. Scroll down, and here is going to be our core API URL, https api.github.com. And then we can use any of these sections here to grab miscellaneous data. The one we want to use the most is going to be this users section here. And we're going to get all users. The URL for this is /users, which makes this very easy. We're going to open up a new tab, api.github.com/users. Press enter, and this is the JSON that comes back from this API call. We can see that this username is Majombo, defunct. I have no idea how to say that, and it keeps going on and on and on. We want to make sure we don't get too many, so we will also attach a URL parameter for per_page is equal to 10. That means we only get 10 users. This will be the API call we make from our application to get these 10 users. We'll come back over. Angular already has a built-in library to make HTTP calls to an API. Normally, if you're using a JavaScript or jQuery application, you would bring in a library like Axios. Here, we're going to use Angular's HTTP library. We'll go into app module. Since we want to use Angular's HTTP library, we have to go and add it to our app module so that Angular knows we want to use it. Import HTTP client module from Angular common HTTP. And that's where they have placed the HTTP library in the common section. Now we're going to copy this HTTP client module and paste it into imports. Now we have access to the HTTP library. Let's go into app-component.ts and let's test this out. So here under app component, this is where we're going to put everything. We don't even need that title anymore. Constructor. Now the way that these classes work is we're going to have a constructor where we inject everything that's needed for this class. In this case, we need private HTTP client. Press enter and it gets added here. And notice it's HTTP client, not HTTP client module. The module is kind of the entire library that gets imported into Angular. But for the HTTP calls, we just want HTTP client. So we have that here. Now, when our page loads, we want to tell it to go to that GitHub API and use it. So Angular has lifecycle hooks. One on when this component gets initialized is called ng-on-init. So on init, we're going to say this.http since we injected it as a property to this class called http.get. And let's go copy that URL we had right here, api.github.com. So we'll paste that here. And now we are going to get the data from that API call. Angular's HTTP library returns what's called observables. And if you're not familiar with observables, they're kind of the upgrade over promises. Normally, if you're using a promise, you would do .then data, and I'm going to use an ES6 arrow function here. You would console.log the data here. But since we have an observable, we're going to subscribe to it. And the cool thing about observables is that it's data over time. So as this HTTP call starts to emit different values, this subscribed will automatically get those new values. So instead of polling, like let's say with promises, you would listen every 5 seconds for new data. This happens automatically with observables. We're observing the data stream. All right, so we have this app component. We save that. Let's go to the home page. Oh, we didn't even route link this Angular logo. So we'll click on home here, console. And here, let's clear this. That's a ton of information. Clear it. Here is our 10 users that came back from our GitHub API. Now, while it's great to have this HTTP call directly inside of our component, this isn't the best for scalability because what happens if we want to get these users again on another component, right? So we would have to copy this constructor and this ng-on-init call and put it into our other components because we want to use this in user list component. But then what happens if we have two separate HTTP calls? We want to change per page to 20. Now we would have to change it in two places. And that doesn't really do well for scalability. Angular has what's called services. And this is where we group together all of our API calls. I'm going to create a service now. Clear this. ngg service. I'm going to call mine user service, since this is going to be handling going to grab users. If you wanted, you could call it GitHub user service or just GitHub service. It all depends on your application, but since this is a simple one, we're getting users, I'm just going to call it user service. All right, source app user service. Now the thing about when Angular builds out services, it doesn't add them to modules automatically like it does components. We'll have to do that ourselves. And we'll talk a little bit more about organizational structure towards the end of this course. We'll open this back up. We have our new user service. Let's register this in the top level app module. Services go under providers, user service, and it automatically gets imported from .user.service. All right, now we can start using this user service. Let's define this. Here is the core of a service. We have our constructor where we're going to inject the private HTTP client. And it did the import as well for us from Angular common HTTP. Now we need a couple things, right? We're going to get all users. Get users. And then we're also going to get a single user by their username. And I'm just using this as a placeholder here, get user, and we're going to pass in a username, and we're going to tell TypeScript this is going to be a string. And that is the core of our user service. Now here, let's go over here to our app component. Let's take this HTTP call out of here. We don't need that ng-on-init anymore. We don't need to inject this HTTP client, and we don't need that import anymore here. Our app component is back to being a very simple app component. Totally compartmentalized, doesn't have to worry about any HTTP calls, and we're going to paste this here. Now our get user will be very similar. We're going to copy this, paste this down here, but we're not even going to subscribe to these things inside of our user service. That's going to be handled by the component. We're just going to return each of these HTTP calls. If I can spell return correctly, there we go. And one thing I like to do, we're kind of writing out this URL here twice now. I'm going to say API URL is equal to that. Now I could turn this into template backticks, ES6 template strings, this.api URL per page 20 here, and then same goes for down here, this.api URL slash username, and these are template backticks. And I don't need that per page since we're getting a single user. And that is going to be our user service. Let's take a quick look at this. Instead of at component, the decorator used for components, Angular will use an at injectable decorator to tell us that this class user service is going to be a service. We have injected HTTP client here as a property called HTTP. And then we have get users and get a single user where we pass in a username, which is a string. And these are the two URLs we have. Now we can use this user service. We can inject it into multiple components and use these accordingly. In the next lesson, we're going to use this user service inside of our users user list component to grab the 10 users that we're going to show. I want to take a step back now and let's talk about the foundations of Angular. And we'll just have, instead of slides, we're going to do this right in our editor. So the way that Angular works is it has a couple different concepts around it. And the first one is going to be modules. Now, modules are going to be the way that we can organize parts of our Angular applications into sections. And if we open up app module and zoom out, since that is giant, let's zoom out a little. Okay. Now, what happens here is we have our imports, our ES6 imports, and you'll see a lot of ES6 imports in Angular. You'll see it a lot in React. That's just the way that the JavaScript world is moving. And I really like the import statements because instead of just trying to grab things globally, like if you're using jQuery, you just use $, and maybe you didn't load the jQuery library yet, $, wouldn't work. But here, we'll know exactly what we're using. Now, declarations, we're using app component. Imports are the modules we're importing. Providers are services. And Bootstrap is what's going to start our application. So I know that sounds like a lot, but really, an ng module, and this is what's called a decorator. And a decorator is a way we can add extra metadata to this class. So instead of configuring all this stuff inside the class, we can say declarations here. We're just adding a decorator here. So this kind of tells this class what it's going to be using. So we have our main app module, and this is where we're going to register everything for this main part of our application. Now, the cool thing is you noticed that when we did our demo, the user section was lazy loaded. We told the user section, hey, load this users module, which we'll create in a later lesson. And that's how lazy loading works. These modules help Angular to know what sections are what in our application. So if we want to use something, just remember to register it in a module, and then our Angular will know that it exists and know how to use it. Let's step forward into our component, and here is our component template right here. And actually, let's show this off. We're going to open up our, well, let's exit out of this, and I want to use the built-in VS Code terminal. Now, my Angular site, the way that we run an Angular application, if you're using the Angular CLI, is ng serve. Now, the Angular CLI went and served our application. It built out 5 files: inline, main, polyfills, styles, and vendor. And then we can go over to our Chrome localhost 4200 is where our Angular app gets started. And here is our main app component. You can see welcome to app. Let's split this out to the right. We'll split this out to the left. Close that. Close this. And the cool thing about the Angular CLI, as soon as we save any files, it will automatically update the browser. So this is our full template, and this is a lot of stuff here. We're not even going to need this. Let's delete all of this. And the router outlet is needed. That's where our routes are going to get output to. And we're going to say, hello, I am an Angular application. And for fun, let's do an emoji for fire. Save, and then watch the right side immediately get updated. So Angular CLI handles all of this for us. It's using Webpack under the web. It's using Webpack Dev Server to do all of this hot reloading and fun stuff. So that's what the Angular CLI does for us, right? We start up our application with one line, and then we serve it with one line, and then we can just start working, and it automatically updates. But this is going to be the foundation for an Angular component. We have our component decorator, and then we have our component class and our template. And we'll see how we can build out more components really soon, but components are a really good way to build up our application into modularized parts. And then we'll look at our app routing module, const routes. This is where we're going to be writing out our routes. And the cool thing about TypeScript, if you're not sold on TypeScript, and I wasn't at first, but now I'm a really big fan of TypeScript. Where did that come from? TypeScript, by typing things, it helps you to find errors quickly. And also it self-documents your code. So you know that this routes, and you could totally do it without the typings, right? You can say just const routes is equal to, I don't know, let's write in some random path is going to be blank, and the component we're going to use. And here, let's talk about component name. We'll say home component. And that'll be something we build, right? But if we don't know what's going on in this routes, okay, path, component name, this probably won't work because it won't work. we would have to go into the Angular documentation, find the routes documentation, and figure out exactly what to call this route, how we would create this route. But since we had routes here, and we'll click save, Angular and TypeScript can tell us that we're already making errors. So if I hover over this, it'll say component name is not assignable to a route. Oh, okay. Well, let's try a component. Okay, so we'll delete that. Component is now normal. No errors there. If we go to home component, cannot find name home component. So this TypeScript is really, really good at finding errors for us before we actually go to our browser and have to inspect element over there. So if we do this and I start typing, let's delete that. If I start typing in component, Angular and TypeScript already know, hey, do you want to use component? So this is what we call self-documenting, and the typings from TypeScript help us build faster. So we'll say, okay, I want component, home component, and we haven't defined that yet, but that's kind of the idea behind TypeScript, is by using types and saying, oh, this is going to be of type routes, this array, it helps us to build faster because our documentation is right in our editor. So that's the routing module. And then notice we have the router module. We're exporting the routing module. And if we go back to, do I need to save that? Yeah, I do need to save that. So let's save this, close that, close a couple more things. And let's go back into app module. Notice that our app routing module is here. So this ng module, this main app module, is where we register everything, and we'll see that soon. So this is kind of the foundation of an Angular application. You have modules, you have components, and all of those get put together to build out our app.